Whatever you were doing before this moment, whatever thoughts were pulling at you, whatever concerns were arranging themselves into lists, you can let them wait. They will still be there. They are patient in that way. Right now, there is only this: a voice, a little darkness, the particular quiet of late night, which is different from the quiet of early morning, deeper somehow, less about what is coming and more about what is past. What we are going to explore tonight is old, older than the questions themselves. We are going to move slowly through a subject that does not have tidy edges, that does not resolve into an answer or click into place at the end. And that is not a failure of the material. That is, in some ways, the entire point. There. We are going to think about civilizations, not as entries in a history textbook, not as slides in a classroom, but as something more like what they actually were: collections of living people, curious, hungry, grieving, joyful, confused, who built things, wrote things, loved things, and then, somehow, stopped. Some of them left records, some left monuments, some left nothing but the faintest impression in the soil, the outline of a foundation, a layer of ash, a scatter of ceramic fragments that scientists piece together like a conversation they can only half hear. And some of them, the ones we will spend most of our time with tonight, left behind something stranger still. They left questions. We often talk about ancient history as though it is a story we have mostly figured out, as though the work of archaeology and linguistics and paleoclimatology has gradually filled in the gaps, the way a photograph develops in a dark room. Shapes becoming clearer, edges sharpening, the image resolving into something recognizable. But that is not quite right. The closer you look at some of these civilizations, the stranger it gets. The picture does not sharpen. It blurs. Details that seemed solid begin to float. The narrative that appeared to hold everything together, quietly, comes apart. And what you are left with is not ignorance exactly. It is something more interesting than that. It is the shape of a mystery. Tonight, we will visit several of them. The Indus Valley people, who built some of the most sophisticated cities of the ancient world, and then, around 1900 BCE, simply ceased, their script still unread, their purpose still unknown. The Maya of the Classic period, whose collapse has been studied for over a century without anyone arriving at a single, satisfying explanation. The Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, Mycenae, Ugarit, Hatti, which fell within decades of each other in an event historians now call the Late Bronze Age Collapse, as if naming a disaster made it comprehensible. And others still, cultures that flourished, invented, traded, prayed, and then receded from history like a tide pulling back from a shore. We do not know why. We have theories. We always have theories. But we do not know. And what I want to offer tonight is not a tour of those theories. There are other places to find those. What I want to offer instead is something simpler and perhaps more valuable. A chance to sit with the not knowing, to feel its texture, to notice what it does to the mind when you stop reaching for the answer and simply allow the question to be as large as it actually is. Because these are not small questions. They are questions about what it means for a people to exist, about what civilization is made of and what it is built on, and whether those things can disappear without a trace, about whether every culture contains within it the seeds of its own dissolution, or whether there are forces, external, unexpected, indifferent, that arrive and remake the world without asking anyone's permission. Find a comfortable position if you have not already. Let your breathing slow down a little. There is nowhere you need to be. And ask yourself this very quietly before we begin. If everything you had built, everything your people had built over centuries, disappeared without a trace, what would you want the silence to say? There is a particular kind of grief that belongs to archaeologists. It does not announce itself. It does not come with obvious cause. It lives somewhere in the gap between what the evidence shows and what the evidence means. And that gap in the study of ancient civilizations can be vast. You spend years at a site. You sift through layers of soil, each centimeter a century. You catalog fragments. You date them. You reconstruct, through painstaking inference, the rough shape of how people lived, where they slept, what they ate, how they traded, what they made. And then you arrive at the question that all of that work was moving toward. What happened to them? And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the evidence simply runs out. The layers stop. The artifacts thin. The settlement contracts into something unrecognizable and then disappears altogether, replaced by silence and time and the patient work of erosion. There is no dramatic ending. There is no visible moment of catastrophe. There is only the absence of what was there before. The grief, I think, comes from the realization that this is how most things end. Not with fire, not with a final recorded sentence, but with a gradual thinning, and then nothing. We are not well equipped, as a species, to sit comfortably with the absence of explanation. The human mind is a meaning-making instrument. It was designed, if that is even the right word, to find patterns, to construct narratives, to reach toward the cause that explains the effect. This is not a flaw. It is how we survived. It is how we built the world we live in. But it creates a strange kind of discomfort when confronted with something that genuinely resists explanation, something that stares back at all our questions with the same flat silence. We do not like that silence. We tend to fill it. Throughout history, every major unexplained disappearance has attracted a galaxy of proposed explanations. Drought, invasion, epidemic, soil exhaustion, trade route disruption, internal revolt, volcanic eruption, migration, collapse of elite power structures, climate shift. All of these have been advanced with varying degrees of evidence to explain one or another of the civilizations that simply stopped. And in many cases, some combination of these factors probably did play a role. The honest answer, the one that experts will often give you if you push them, is probably several things interacting in ways we do not fully understand over a period of time longer than a human lifespan, affecting people who could not see what was happening to them any more clearly than we can see what is happening to us. That last part is worth sitting with. They could not see it either. The people living in the last generations of the Indus Valley civilization did not know they were the last generations. They woke in the morning. They tended to their affairs. They conducted their rituals, whatever those were. And we genuinely do not know because we have not read their script. They loved their children. They argued with their neighbors. They watched the seasons turn. And the civilization slowly came undone around them, as perhaps all civilizations eventually do. And most of them never knew they were living through an ending. There is a philosopher's thought experiment that goes something like this. If you could know the exact date of your death, would you want to know? Most people, when they consider it honestly, say no. There is something merciful about not knowing. But there is also something haunting about the idea that an ending, a real, total, irreversible ending, can approach for decades, for generations, without anyone recognizing it for what it is. That a civilization can be in the process of vanishing while its people go about their days completely unaware. Does that sound familiar? It is worth asking, in the dark, whether any of us would recognize our own version of that threshold. The philosopher George Santayana is often quoted as saying that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. It is a satisfying idea, tidy. It implies that history is a teacher and that the lesson is learnable. But the civilizations we are exploring tonight suggest something more complicated. They did remember their past. Many of them had deep traditions, long memories, complex record-keeping systems. They were not ignorant of what had come before. And yet, the question might not be whether we remember. The question might be whether remembering is enough, whether understanding is enough, whether intention is enough, whether there are forces, environmental, social, astronomical, or simply strange, that move through civilizations the way weather moves through landscape, indifferently, without malice, without a lesson to teach. What would it mean if the most important things that happen to a civilization are the things it never manages to understand? Let us go back. Not as a thought experiment, not as metaphor. Let us actually go back as far as the evidence allows and stand at the edge of what we know. Around 2600 BCE, in the broad river plains of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, a civilization was reaching its apex. We call it the Indus Valley Civilization, or sometimes the Harappan culture, named for Harappa, one of its two great cities, The other was Mohenjo-Daro, which translates roughly as Mound of the Dead, a name given not by its original inhabitants, but by archaeologists who excavated it in the 1920s. What its inhabitants called it, we do not know. What we do know is this. At its height, this civilization covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Its population may have been over 5 million people. Its cities were planned with a geometric precision that would not appear again in human history for over 1,000 years. The streets ran on a grid. The drains were covered. The houses had indoor plumbing. Think about that for a moment. Indoor plumbing in 2500 BCE in cities that covered miles of terrain. A water infrastructure system so sophisticated that comparable technology did not reach most of the world until the 19th century CE. These were not primitive people. They were not stumbling toward civilization. They had arrived. They had granaries, standardized weights and measures, what appear to be proto-democratic city planning arrangements. Or at least, there is no evidence of the massive palace complexes and royal tombs that characterize Mesopotamia and Egypt at the same period. No great pyramids, no monuments to individual power, just orderly, prosperous, organized cities stretching across a landscape the size of Western Europe. And then, beginning around 1900 BCE, something changed. The cities began to depopulate. People moved. Smaller settlements downstream, to the east, became more common. The great urban centers of the heartland, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, contracted. The standardized quality of pottery declined. The distinctive Indus script, which appears on thousands of small seals, stopped being used. Trade with distant cultures dropped off. By 1700 BCE, give or take, the great phase of the Indus Valley civilization was over. The script has never been deciphered. We have over 4,000 inscribed objects. The script appears to use somewhere between 400 and 600 signs. Scholars have been working on it for a century. There are proposed decipherments, several of them, but none has achieved consensus. None has convinced the broader scholarly community, which means that everything those seals say, every name, every number, every prayer or curse or mercantile record remains completely opaque to us. The Indus Valley people spoke to us. They wrote things down, carefully, repeatedly, in a system they clearly understood, and we cannot hear them. Move now, across the world, forward in time, to the forests and limestone plateaus of Mesoamerica. The Maya. No civilization in the pre-Columbian Americas achieved what the Maya achieved at their classic peak. From roughly the 3rd to the 9th century CE, their mathematics were extraordinary. They had independently developed the concept of zero. Their astronomy was meticulous enough to predict solar eclipses centuries in advance. Their architecture rose in jungle clearings to heights that required generations of sustained effort and social organization. And their cities, Tikal, Palenque, Copan, Calakmul, were places of genuine splendor. Not the splendor of one ruler, but the accumulated beauty of continuous, layered, living civilization. In the 9th century CE, the classic Maya lowland cities began to collapse. Not overnight. Over the course of roughly 100 years, the great centers of the southern lowlands were depopulated. No more major monuments were built. The long count calendar, which had been maintained with obsessive precision for centuries, stopped being inscribed around 910 CE. Some cities were abandoned so abruptly that archaeologists have found evidence of meals half-eaten, work half-completed, the ordinary business of life interrupted. And then, silence. The Maya did not disappear. Their descendants are alive today, millions of them across Mexico and Central America. The civilization did not vanish in the way that word sometimes implies, but the classic period, that specific flowering of urban complexity, of long-distance trade, of monumental architecture, of political and intellectual achievement, that did come to an end, suddenly enough that it has occupied scholars for over a century. The current best thinking involves a cascading series of failures, prolonged droughts, intensified by the particular vulnerability of a civilization built on rain-fed agriculture, in an environment that does not forgive long, dry spells. Political fragmentation, increasing warfare between city-states, ecological degradation, the silting of reservoirs, possibly epidemic disease, all of these at once. A system under strain from multiple directions until something finally gave way. And then there's the late Bronze Age collapse, perhaps the most dramatic civilizational catastrophe of the ancient world, and the least understood. Around 1200 BCE, within the space of roughly 50 years, almost every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean was destroyed or severely disrupted. The Mycenaean Greeks, gone. Their palace culture, their linear bee riding system, their long-distance trade networks, gone. The Hittite Empire, which had been a major power for centuries, controlling most of Anatolia, gone. The city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, a cosmopolitan trading hub where 5 languages were written in cuneiform, destroyed and never rebuilt. Egypt survived, but barely, and emerged fundamentally weakened. The interconnected world of the late 2nd millennium, BCE, simply unraveled. We have a letter discovered at the site of Ugarit. It was written in the last days before the city fell, from the king of Al-Ashia to the king of Ugarit. It describes ships, enemy ships, spotted at sea. It urges preparation. It asks for help. It was never sent. It was found still in the kiln, being baked for preservation when the city was destroyed. What does it mean that we can hold in our hands a letter that no one ever received, written in a city that no one ever left? Here is what we do not know. We do not know who the Sea Peoples were. The Sea Peoples appear in Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III, around 1177 BCE, as raiders who swept in from the sea and contributed to the destruction of the Bronze Age world. They're depicted on temple walls in vivid, almost cinematic carved reliefs. Warriors in horned or feathered helmets, ships with bird prow figureheads, prisoners in long robes. They have names: the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denayan, the Weshesh. And that is nearly all we know about them. Where did they come from? Speculation places them everywhere from the Aegean to Sicily to Anatolia to Sardinia. Were they refugees from the collapse? People displaced by whatever was destroying the Bronze Age world, now themselves contributing to its destruction? Were they opportunistic raiders taking advantage of weakened states? Were they a confederation of peoples united by crisis? Were they, in some sense, the collapse itself, wearing a human face? We do not know. A century of scholarship has produced no consensus. This is not for lack of trying. The question of the late Bronze Age collapse has attracted some of the finest historians and archaeologists of the past 100 years. It has generated libraries of research. It has been re-examined with every new technology: isotope analysis, climate proxies drawn from ice cores and tree rings, satellite surveys of ancient landscapes, network analysis of trade routes and their fragility. Each new approach reveals something. Each new revelation raises new questions. The picture never quite resolves. There's a word used in archaeology and ancient history that I find both useful and quietly devastating. The word is lacuna. It means, technically, a gap in a manuscript, a place where the text has been lost or damaged, where the parchment rotted or the clay tablet broke. But it has come to mean, more broadly, any gap in the historical record, any silence where knowledge used to be. The ancient world is full of lacunae. Most of what was ever written has not survived. Most of what was ever said was never written. Most of what was ever felt, feared, believed, dreamed, all of that existed only in the minds of people who have been dead for millennia. And it died with them. What we have, the temples, the tablets, the coins, the bones, is not the past. It is the debris of the past. And from that debris, we try to reconstruct not just events, but meaning. Consider the Minoans. They were a Bronze Age civilization centered on the island of Crete, reaching their peak around 1700 to 1450 BCE. Their palace at Knossos was a labyrinthine complex of hundreds of rooms, with sophisticated drainage systems, large-scale storage facilities, and frescoes of such elegance and vitality that when they were rediscovered in the early 20th century, they looked almost modern. Dolphins and leaping figures, women with elaborate hairstyles and confident postures, bulls, always bulls. The Minoans had their own writing system, which we call Linear A. It predates the Linear B script used by the Mycenaeans, which we can read. Linear A has not been deciphered. Like the Indus script, it exists in enough examples for analysis, but has resisted all attempts at interpretation. So we look at their art and their architecture and their trade goods. Minoan artifacts have been found from Egypt to Syria to the Levant, and we know they were prosperous and connected and clearly engaged with the world. But what they believed, what they called themselves, what myths they told their children at night, we do not know. Around 1450 BCE, most of the Minoan palace sites were destroyed. The cause is disputed. Mycenaean invasion, internal conflict, the after effects of the Thera volcanic eruption, likely some combination. Knossos survived, but under Mycenaean control, and the distinct Minoan culture faded. They had no successors who remembered them the way they remembered themselves. There is something in that worth sitting with. A culture's self-image, the story it tells about where it came from, what it is, what it values, exists primarily in the minds of its people and in the texts they produce. When those people are gone and those texts are unreadable, what remains is an outline, a shape without a center, a face without eyes. We can describe the Minoans. We cannot hear them. We can map the Indus Valley cities down to individual buildings. We cannot read a single word they wrote. We can trace the trade networks of the Bronze Age Mediterranean with remarkable precision. We cannot explain why they all failed at once. And there are others, less famous, that most people have never heard of. Cahokia, the vast pre-Columbian city near what is now St. Louis, which may have had a population of 20,000 people at its height in the 12th century CE, larger than contemporary London. It was abandoned before European contact. No one knows why. The Cucuteni Tripilia culture of Eastern Europe, who built some of the largest settlements in the Neolithic world, then systematically burned their own villages every 60 to 80 years. Deliberately, completely, every one. For centuries. We do not know why. Current theories range from ritual practice to population cycling to agricultural reset. None is fully satisfying. The people of Easter Island, Rapa Nui, who carved and transported and erected the vast stone figures called moai in an act of sustained communal effort that seems almost physically impossible given their resources, and whose civilization was in severe decline by the time European ships arrived, for reasons that are still actively debated. If these civilizations could speak to us across the gap of time, do you imagine what they would say would be an explanation? Or simply the same bewildered silence we feel when we look back at them? Time does not work the way we think it does. Not in physics, not in experience, and certainly not in history. In physics, time is a dimension, a direction, like up or sideways, but one we can only travel in one way. In experience, time is elastic. 20 minutes waiting for news can feel like hours. A decade of ordinary contentment can compress, in memory, into a single afternoon. In history, time does something stranger still. It flattens. When we look at the late Bronze Age collapse, we speak of events that unfolded over 50 years, as if they were a single event. 50 years is 2 full human generations. It is the difference between a child being born and that child growing old and watching their grandchildren take their first steps. A 50-year period of gradual, painful civilizational collapse would not feel like collapse to the people living through it. It would feel like life, a difficult life, a life of increasing scarcity and instability and fear. But life, with ordinary days in the middle of it, with ordinary loves and ordinary grievances. History compresses this into a phrase: the collapse, as if it happened on a Tuesday. There is a thought experiment I find useful here, though I offer it gently and without insisting on any particular conclusion. Imagine someone from the future, say 3,000 years from now, trying to piece together our civilization from what survived. They have fragments, some digital media somehow preserved, though not all of it, and not in formats they can easily read. Some physical structures, some biological traces, a lot of plastic, probably. What would they make of us? Would they understand what we valued, what we feared, what we argued about endlessly, with such conviction that it seemed like the most important thing in the world? Would they be able to read the quiet parts, the letters never sent, the conversations in kitchens, the thoughts people had but never recorded? Or would they see only the outline, the shape of a civilization without the interior? The philosopher Derek Parfit wrote about what he called the bias toward the future, our tendency to care more about what will happen than about what has already happened. A toothache tomorrow worries us more than an equal toothache last week. But there is also, in historical thinking, a kind of bias toward the present, a tendency to imagine that people who came before us were fundamentally different, less conscious somehow, less complex, less fully alive in the way we feel ourselves to be alive. The evidence from the archaeological record suggests otherwise. The letter from the king of Al-Ashia, baked in the kiln, never delivered. That was written by someone with a nervous system not meaningfully different from ours. Someone who felt urgency, who was trying to prevent something, who understood that time was running out. The Minoan frescoes show people laughing, dancing, watching sports with what looks unmistakably like excitement. The Indus Valley cities show people who cared about cleanliness, about order, about the design of the spaces where they lived. These are not primitive impulses. These are recognizably human ones. And that recognition is, I think, both comforting and slightly vertiginous. Comforting because it means we are not alone in time. Across thousands of years, the same quality of awareness, the same capacity for meaning-making and grief and beauty has been present in human beings. Vertiginous because it means those people, People just like us, who loved their children and worried about their futures and felt the strange, particular ache of being conscious and mortal. Those people are entirely gone. Their cities are mounds in the earth. Their languages are ink on unreadable tablets. Their gods are footnotes in academic papers. And we will not be the exception. Whatever we build, whatever we create, whatever we believe with such certainty is lasting and important and real, will become, at some remove of time, archaeological. Our monuments will be studied. Our texts will be partially preserved and partially lost. Future researchers will look at the patterns of our settlements and try to infer why we did what we did. And they will get some of it right, and some of it wrong, and some of it will be simply beyond recovery. This is not a counsel of despair. I do not offer it that way. It is, I think, an invitation to a kind of perspective, to see the present moment, this strange, improbable civilization we happen to inhabit, as neither uniquely doomed nor uniquely special, as one in a long series of human arrangements that arose, flourished, and eventually changed into something unrecognizable. Civilizations do not simply end, they transform. Their people move, adapt, merge with other peoples, carry fragments of what they were into new configurations. The genes of ancient Harappan farmers are present in the DNA of living people in South Asia. The architectural traditions of the Minoans echo through Greek culture and into Rome and into the world we inhabit. The astronomical knowledge of the Maya is woven into our modern calendar. Nothing is entirely lost. But the particular arrangement, the specific civilization, with its specific language and script and beliefs and way of organizing urban space and understanding the cosmos, that particular configuration does seem to end. If consciousness is not truly individual, if what we call a self is more like a temporary shape that awareness takes before dissolving back into something larger, then what, exactly, is it that disappears when a civilization vanishes? There are things we will never know. This is not a failure of ambition or technology. It is simply the nature of time and entropy and the fragility of the human record. We will never know what the Indus Valley script says. We may decipher it. New computational methods, new bilingual discoveries, new approaches could change everything. Or we may not. The honest assessment, held by most experts in the field, is that the script is short enough in its average inscription length and unknown enough in its underlying language family that a firm consensus decipherment may be permanently beyond our reach. Those seals spoke. We cannot hear them. We will never know the specific beliefs of the late Bronze Age peoples who left no written records. The farmers of Central Europe in the 4th millennium BCE, who buried their dead with grave goods and arranged their settlements with apparent intention and presumably felt and thought and believed complex things. We can infer almost nothing about their inner lives. We will never know why the builders of Cahokia left. We will never know what the Minoans called their gods. There is a category of loss that is almost too complete for grief in the ordinary sense. Loss that swallows not just the thing itself, but the framework that would allow us to understand what has been lost. We cannot grieve for the Indus Valley script the way we grieve for a lost book, because we do not know what the script contained. We can only grieve for the not knowing, for the permanent blankness in a space where meaning used to be. This kind of loss has a particular quality that is worth describing carefully. It is not the sharp loss of a death or the dull loss of estrangement. It is not the loss of something we had and can remember clearly. It is the loss of something we know existed, but cannot hold, cannot quite imagine, cannot even properly mourn because we lack the vocabulary of what it was. It is the loss of the specific, of the irreplaceable instance in all its particular detail and texture and meaning. Think about the last speaker of a language. Linguists who have documented this moment, and it has happened in living memory more times than we care to count, describe it as one of the most quietly devastating things a human being can witness. The last speaker of a language carries in their mind an entire way of dividing up reality, a particular grammar, which is to say, a particular logic, a set of metaphors through which the world is made sense of, vocabulary for phenomena that other languages can only approximate. When that person dies, that entire cognitive universe becomes inaccessible, not destroyed. It existed, but closed, permanently. The ancient world is nothing but last speakers. Every silenced language is a universe that closed. And yet, there is something in this that is not purely loss. The silence itself is a kind of communication. It tells us something important, that what we have is not permanent, that every configuration of human knowledge and language and culture is temporary, that the things we consider most fundamental, our categories of thought, our ways of making meaning, our certainties, are, in the longest view, contingent arrangements that arose under specific conditions and will not necessarily survive those conditions changing. This is not nihilism. It is, if anything, an argument for paying attention, for noticing the specific, the local, the unrepeatable, because the specific is exactly what time erases first. The archaeologist David Wengrow, writing with the anthropologist David Graeber, makes an argument that I find genuinely startling, that the diversity of human social arrangements throughout prehistory was far greater than we have tended to assume. That ancient peoples experimented with governance, with social organization, with ways of living together in forms we have largely lost access to, and that this loss is not merely historical, but actively constrains our political imagination today. We do not know what we do not know. We cannot imagine possibilities that have been erased from the record. The civilizations that vanished took with them not just their own answers to human problems, but possibly they're questions. Questions we no longer know to ask. Somewhere in those thousands of Indus Valley seals, there may be a description of a way of organizing collective life that solved problems we still struggle with, that achieved things we still reach toward. We will probably never know. The silence will not answer. What would it mean to inherit a loss you cannot name, from people you cannot remember, for a knowledge you cannot imagine, and to carry it forward, unknowing, into everything you build? We come, eventually, to the end of what can be said. Not because the subject is exhausted, it is far from exhausted, but because this kind of exploration has a different relationship to endings than most. It does not resolve, it opens. What we have moved through tonight, the Indus Valley, the Maya, the Bronze Age world, the Minoans, Cahokia, and all the others who waited at the edges of our attention, none of them offered us a conclusion. None of them said, "Here is what happened. Here is why. Here is what it means." They gave us something else instead. They gave us scale. There is a particular kind of humility that the ancient world offers if you are willing to receive it. Not the humility of diminishment, not the feeling that we are small and therefore unimportant, but something closer to perspective. The recognition that we are one chapter in a very long story, and that the chapters before us were rich and complex, and did not simply exist as a prelude to our arrival. Those people were not waiting for us to excavate them. They were living. And that life, in all its difficulty and beauty and specificity, was complete in itself, even if it left us puzzled. I want to leave you with something that is not quite a thought, and not quite a feeling, but somewhere in between. It is the image of the letter from Ugarit, still in the kiln. Someone wrote it. Someone placed it in the fire to harden the clay, to preserve the message, to ensure it would survive the journey to wherever it needed to go. And then something happened, and the city fell, and the letter stayed. It waited in the ground for 3,000 years, this urgent message, this cry for help, this record of fear. It waited through the rise and fall of dozens of other civilizations, through the invention of writing systems that could have read it, but did not know it existed, through the coming of empires and the going of empires, through every century of human striving and forgetting. And eventually, someone dug it up and read it. And it turned out that the message had arrived after all. Just very, very late. There is something in that which feels important, the persistence of the record, even when the sender and the intended recipient are both gone. The way meaning can travel across time in forms we did not expect. To recipients, we could not have imagined. To be received in ways we will never know about. We are, all of us, receiving messages from the dead tonight. Every ruin, every undeciphered script every legend that was once someone's recorded history. All of it is addressed to us, even if we cannot fully read it. And we are, all of us, composing messages for people who do not exist yet, in forms we cannot quite control, about things we do not fully understand. The civilizations we have visited tonight, the ones that vanished without explanation, maybe they did not vanish entirely. Maybe they're still here, in fragments, in the question itself, in the specific quality of curiosity that the not knowing produces, in the way that a gap in the record can feel like a presence, in the quiet that happens after a question is asked and before any answer arrives. Let the quiet stay for a while. You do not need to fill it. You do not need to reach toward anything. Just let the question breathe in the dark, where it lives. What if the questions are not the absence of knowledge, but the form knowledge takes when it reaches the very edge of what can be known?